Hey guys, it's Mel. Welcome to my channel. And welcome to my top 5 video. In this video, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about myself and my reading habits. I recently watched Alexa from Library of Alexa's first video, in which she did a little bit of a similar thing. So she went through a few different lists of 5 things about herself, and I really enjoyed that video. I thought that sounded like something that would be a cool video to make. I will link her video in the description below if you want to check it out. I highly recommend that you do. She's a fantastic booktuber. Anyway, on with my video. My first list of 5 things is 5 books that have had a big impact on me in my life. I'm cheating a little bit because this is actually the box set of the Lord of the Rings trilogy and The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. These books were read to me when I was a young child, and then later I read them to myself, and I've probably read them to the point where I almost can't read them anymore because I know them so well. I doubt very much that I really need to go into much detail about the Lord of the Rings. I think everyone knows the stories of the Lord of the Rings pretty well. They definitely impacted my love of fantasy, my love of storytelling, my love of other world, big epic fantastical stories that a lot of fantasy does. So that was the Lord of the Rings trilogy and The Hobbit. The next book that's had a big impact on me is The Silver Hand by Stephen Lawhead. This is actually the second book in a trilogy called the Song of Albion trilogy. I read this trilogy when I was in grade 10, so I would have been 15, I think, and I absolutely loved the series. It's another fantasy book, and it's about a couple of adults who stumble through a cairn, or sort of a burial site, up in Scotland, and go back in time to a time when the Celts ruled the British Isles and it was known as Albion. So there's some mythological and historical information in here, and there's also a big element of fantasy and adventure. I already loved fantasy when I read this, but the way that it changed my life is that it made me realize that I also really love mythology and history, and it was because of this series of books that I went on to do ancient history in my last 2 years of high school, and from there went on to study ancient history and classics at university. This has had a really big impact on my life. The next book is The Beekeeper's Apprentice. This is the first book in the Mary Russell series. Anyone that's watched my October to be read video will know that I had planned, and actually have already read, The Pirate King, which is about the 6th or 7th book in this series that this is the first one of. This is the book that made me branch out from fantasy a bit and start exploring other types of books. This is a mystery book, and this is actually the book in which the young Mary Russell, she's 15 at the time, meets the retired Sherlock Holmes, and they instantly form a connection that is founded in their intellect and the way that they express themselves, and kind of also their general demeanour. And Sherlock realises that Mary Russell is an incredibly intelligent, observant and thoughtful young woman, so he starts to mentor her. And at first it's quite subtle, but then they start working together on some of his cases and things go from there. So this is a really fantastic book. I highly recommend it to anyone that likes mystery and likes Sherlock Holmes. And like I said, this is the book that made me realise that fantasy wasn't in fact the be-all and end-all of reading, and made me start to explore other genres. It's Editing Mel here. I forgot to talk about The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe when I was making the video. So this lion stands in for The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, which, similar to The Lord of the Rings, was a book that was read to me as a child that I loved and impacted my opinion of reading and my love of reading and storytelling. The last book in my 5 books that have had a really big impact on me is Emma by Jane Austen. I actually have the complete Jane Austen collection up here, and I will get that out a little bit later. I read Emma as part of my English curriculum in high school, and I actually really liked it. I sort of wasn't expecting to like it because I was finding at the time a lot of the classics quite difficult going, but I just fell completely in love with Jane Austen. She writes such really well-rounded characters. All of her characters are very flawed, but they're so believable, and even though they're so flawed, you end up completely loving them. And I just thought Emma was such a fantastic book, and I really loved it. Similar to The Beekeeper's Apprentice, it was a book that brought me out of my fantasy world and into other types of books, and it also made me realize that there are some classics that I will enjoy, and that was a really lovely thing to realize. So it's had a really big impact on me. My next list of 5 is going to be authors that I will always, always read. They may not be authors that I will keep tabs on and source their books the very second they come out, but they're authors that I know that I like and that I know that if I see their work somewhere, I will enjoy it, so I'll pick it up. The first author is Liane Moriarty. I do have one of her books here that I've read in the last year, The Last Anniversary. I won't go into detail about this particular book or any of the books in this list, but I'll just talk about Liane Moriarty and why I like her so much and why I know that I will be able to enjoy any book that she has written. I think Liane Moriarty paints really well-rounded, realistic characters. I think that she tells really engaging stories. They're stories that are easy to read because they're well-paced and all of the plot points are really believable. Even if you think that would never happen to me personally, you can see that it happening to someone and you can see why they make the choices they make and you can see why they end up in the situations they end up in. Even if they're choices that you wouldn't make, you can totally understand how the characters end up in those situations. So in that sense, they're really believable and really relatable. All of the characters, from the minor characters to the major characters in her books, are well-rounded and well-written. There are no characters that I feel are really 2D. They're just well-rounded and well-fleshed out characters. The plot is well written, like I said, and the endings make sense. They come to a conclusion. They're not necessarily always happy endings, but the endings make sense. The next author in this list is Joanne Harris, who wrote Chocolat, which is probably her best-known work and has been made into a movie, as most people would know. I always come back to her work because I really love the way that she writes. She has a very poetical, almost lyrical way of writing her stories, and I just think that they flow together really, really well. They're very quirky stories. The characters are always kind of odd and quirky, and she writes the plots in a way that you just wouldn't expect, but they work so well together. Because her descriptions are so lyrical, you get a real sense of the setting. I'm not at all surprised that Chocolat was made into such a lovely movie because the prose in this book is almost like a screenplay. I love it. I highly recommend Chocolat and anything by Joanne Harris, particularly if you like magical realism. So yeah, for the next author, I'm actually going to go back to L'Oreal King, who wrote The Beekeeper's Apprentice. She's just such a fantastic writer. I haven't read all of the books that she's written, but every time I see a book of hers, I grab it. They're so well written. She's such an intelligent author. She writes beautifully intelligent, well-rounded characters. Her characters are always really strong characters and really intelligent, really good at what they do. The stories are really well written. You don't get to the end of the book and think, oh, I don't really understand how that connected or how that was concluded. They always make sense, and I just love L'Oreal King. The next author that I can always pick up and enjoy a work of theirs is Marian Keyes. This book is Rachel's Holiday. I think this might be the first book that she ever wrote. This is another really well fleshed out story, really, really well fleshed out characters. I just think it's so well written. She writes contemporary novels, and I'd say you'd probably call them romances, but there's always more to it than the romances. So for example, Rachel's Holiday is not at all what it seems. It's about a young woman, Rachel, who finds herself in rehab after nearly ODing on cocaine, but she's very much in denial and she doesn't recognize that that's what happened. She doesn't recognize that she has a problem, and it's about her struggles to figure that out and to come clean, basically. I like the way that this story is written in two parts. So you have Rachel's story from rehab and what she's going through while she's in rehab, and then you have flashbacks to leading up to the point where she was in rehab. Even though it deals with some quite full-on topics, it's done in a really light-hearted, lovely, almost self-deprecating way that is just really nice to read and really easy to read. My last author is up here on this shelf, and that is Nick Hornby. His most famous is probably High Fidelity, and it's fantastic, but I just like this one the best. Nick Hornby writes darkly comic books. They're really comments on society and the system that we live in and how that affects us. A Long Way Down is written from the perspective of the four main characters, so we swap and change between each character throughout the novel. It starts with all four of them deciding to commit suicide on New Year's Eve, going to the top of a building famous for people committing suicide off it in London. They all go to the top of the same building. They end up being unable to actually jump because they have people watching them, and they end up coming down together, and then they kind of decide to keep track of each other and meet up every now and then. It's about how that changes their lives. Doesn't necessarily make them happier, but it certainly does change how they view the decision they made prior to going up there. So it's a really great book. It's really well written. Like I said, it's a comment on society, but it's not really didactic. It doesn't really hammer that home. It just is written in a really approachable and readable way. So I recommend Nick Hornby. So that was my top 5 authors that I will always read any of their books. The next list of 5 is a list of 5 books that I will always want to reread and really enjoy it when I do. So the first is Harry Potter, and I just love this box set. Unlike a lot of booktubers that I've been watching, I didn't read Harry Potter growing up. So I read Harry Potter when I was in my 20s, but I still love them. I could see that there were some inconsistencies, but nonetheless, they're just really fun books. They're well written. The characters are well realized. I just love the world that J.K. Rowling has built. I think she's done a great job of weaving this idea of magic and a magical world in the world that we know and love, and I just think that that's fantastic. I love the characters of Harry, Hermione and Ron. I think that their friendship is really beautiful. I like the way that they learn about themselves as they grow up and go through what they go through in the books. And I'll always love to reread Harry Potter. For the next book, I'm going to get down my complete works of Jane Austen, because the front cover is a photo from the BBC miniseries that was produced in 1996. So we have Colin Firth as Mr. Darcy and Jennifer L as Elizabeth Bennet. Probably no surprise to anyone that I'm talking about Pride and Prejudice. I love Pride and Prejudice. It is my favourite Jane Austen. It is such a well-written book. I love the characters of Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth. I love how you start out being on Elizabeth's side and thinking that Mr. Darcy is just horrible, and then you come around to realising that Lizzie also has her problems, and of course she is the prejudice of the story, and that they both have flaws, and they both start to realize that they have flaws, and they both start to open up about that, and they start to recognize the other person's good qualities. I love Jane Austen. I think she writes really believable and really loving characters. This is so special to me, this book, because it was bought for me by my grandparents when I was about 17 or 18. A favourite thing when we would spend a lot of time together used to be to watch the BBC miniseries. We just watched it so many times. The next book that I want to talk about, I actually don't specifically want to talk about a book. I actually want to talk about a whole series of books, and that is the Discworld series by Terry Pratchett. I love Terry Pratchett. I think he is so clever. I think that his writing is so witty, satirical, comedic, fantasy. It's everything that I love. He's just amazing. The Discworld is so fantastical and enjoyable and lovely. The characters are so funny and well written. Even though it is satirical, they're actually believable, well-rounded characters. I will show you my favourite Pratchett, Jingo. So yeah, Discworld. The next book that I absolutely can always come back to and reread and love every time I do is Good Omens by Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman. Again, this is so clever. Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett weave such fantastic worlds together. They really get you believing in the worlds, even though they're fantastical and over the top and crazy, and I just love that about them. For those who don't know, Good Omens is set in our world, but it's got a little bit of a twist. It's a story of the apocalypse, or sort of a story of the apocalypse. It follows a variety of different characters, 2 of which are an angel and a demon, who've actually, along the way, become really good friends, and they find out that they actually really like the earth, and they like living here, and they don't really want the apocalypse to happen. So it's about how the apocalypse is averted, sort of. There's a lot going on in this story, lots of different storylines woven in together, lots of different characters. It's just amazing. It's really clever. If you like fantasy, if you like magical realism, if you like apocalypses, if you like satire, you will like this book. So that was my list of 5 books that I have read, reread, and will continue to reread for the rest of my life. Hello. As you can see, this is another day. I was just editing this video and I realised that this next section was actually kind of a mess. So I've decided to refilm it. I'll edit it in today and post it this afternoon. Before I do, I just want to show you my hoodie. It's my favourite hoodie. It says read books, drink coffee, eat chocolate, pet cats, which is pretty much my life. Anyway, this section is the top 5 types of books that I would like to try and read more of in the future. The first couple of items on the list kind of go together under the umbrella of diversity. Really? Firstly, we have LGBTQIAP books. I have been pretty lax in reading queer books and I'd really like to improve on that. So it's at the top of my list. In a similar vein, I have been guilty of being pretty lax about reading books written by Aboriginal authors. So I think that I really need to change that as well. Aboriginal people in Australia are very marginalised. Their voices are very much not heard. Even in 2019, and it's just disgusting, quite frankly, and it may not be much reading books written by Australian Aboriginal authors, but it's something. So those are the top 2 out of the 5, and they lead into number 3, which is books written in own voices format. Own voices is a terminology that I only came across by watching BookTube, but I think it's really important for proper representation of what a queer person or an Australian Aboriginal person or a person of colour or anyone really, that we hear from their perspective. I could write a book with a queer character or an Australian Aboriginal character and that would be fine, but I wouldn't be able to write that authentically because I am neither queer nor Australian Aboriginal. So I haven't experienced what someone who is has experienced. So I think it's really important that we read own voices, and I'm going to make an attempt to pick up a lot more own voices books in the future. Number 4 on this list is non-fiction books. I haven't really read much non-fiction. I think the main reason for that is the way that I tend to read. I don't tend to have 2 or 3 books on the go at once. I tend to have a dedicated fiction book that I'm reading, but I don't think that that works for me when it comes to non-fiction. So I think what might be a better way of doing things is to have a non-fiction book that I can read a chapter or 2 of and then go back to my fiction book that I'm in the middle of reading. We'll see how that goes. The last type of book on this list is graphic novels. I mentioned this in my BookTube newbie tag video, which I will link below, so I won't go into too much detail right now. And now back to the rest of the video. Hi. That was my partner Rowan. The last list of 5 things is 5 TV shows that I really love and often rewatch. First on this list is my absolute favourite TV show. It's been my favourite TV show for a number of years now, and that is Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Buffy the Vampire Slayer is a TV show set in California in America, and it's about a young girl who is the vampire slayer. So she is endowed with all of the strength and speed and healing powers that vampires have so that she can combat vampires and kill them. She also fights demons and other monsters. Buffy is more than just a monster of the week TV show though. It's really a TV show about growing up and about figuring out your life and figuring out how to deal with people and situations that aren't necessarily always good for you. The monsters and the vampires are kind of an allegory for all of the things that we go through in our lives, particularly as teenagers going into young adulthood. For example, probably the most famous is Buffy and Angel. If you know Buffy, you will know what I'm talking about, and if you don't, then I won't go too much into it because I strongly recommend that you go and watch it. But basically, that relationship is the allegory of what happens when you fall in love for the first time and you put yourself out there and you're really vulnerable and it goes badly. How do you deal with that? What do you do? That's why I love Buffy, because even though on the face of it, it's an adventure, monster, bump in the night, there's a lot more going on. The next TV show on this list is The Gilmore Girls. A friend of mine suggested I watch The Gilmore Girls and I kind of teased him about it, but when I actually sat down to watch it, I fell completely in love. I love the witty, fast-paced, intelligent, silly, crazy dialogue. I love the mother-daughter dynamic, both between Lorelai and Rory, which are the 2 main characters, but also between Lorelai and her mother and Rory and her grandmother. I love the overall cast of characters. They're quirky and silly and lovely, and they're so well written and acted. The dialogue is, like I said, fast-paced and dynamic and intelligent, and it's just an amazing show. The next show is something totally different, and that is Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. This is a satirical news show. So John Oliver basically takes a deep dive into a news story of the week or the month and talks about all the problems in that news story and offers explanations as to why that's happening. He focuses particularly on America, but he does also talk about the world at large. It's comedic and funny and thoughtful and intelligent and just fantastic to watch. The next TV show is Sherlock, which is the BBC modern adaptation of the Sherlock Holmes story. It's so good. I really think that they've taken Arthur Conan Doyle's canon and modernized it so well. It's really true to the original stories whilst being really believable and true to the setting of the 21st century. It's just so good. I love it. And the last TV series is actually a very new addition to my top 5 TV shows, which is Good Omens. The miniseries based on the book Good Omens by Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett, and it's just so fantastic. It's so well written. It's really, really close to the book, but they've taken some of the main points of the book and they've turned it into a really engaging and interesting and fascinating TV show. The booktuber Superpower, who I love, has done a really great review of the Good Omens TV show, so I've linked that in the description below. So if you want to know more about the book or the TV show, check her out. It's a really great review and she's a really interesting booktuber. I really like watching her. Read the book, watch the TV show. Thank you so much for watching my 5 lists of 5 things about me and my reading habits and a little bit about my general entertainment habits. I really hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up, consider subscribing to my channel, and thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.